Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Kamhi, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you so much for joining me, Kamhi, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, we are so pleased to have as our guest Dr. Claude Lardinois. And Dr. Claude is Emeritus Professor of Medicine in the Division of Endocrinology at the University of Nevada School of Medicine and graduate faculty for Nevada Studies in Nutrition at the University of Nevada in Reno. He is an endocrinology consultant for Renowned Health and medical director of disease management for American Healthcare in Rockland, California. He does original research and supports others' research interests, including work in nutrition, diabetes, hypertension, and dyslipidemia. He has a special interest in eradicating heart disease, the major cause of death in patients with type 2 diabetes. He's a fellow of the American College of Physicians, a master of the American College of Nutrition, and board certified in internal medicine, endocrinology, and metabolism. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr.
Can you
Claude.
hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you
Great.
very well. So you've had an awful lot of in-depth study, and with all that training and expertise and professorship in conventional medicine, what made you reach out and also get a master's of nutrition?
Well, I really didn't get a master's of nutrition. What it is you apply for the fellowship like the FACP and the FACE on my CV. And then if you're then at each annual meeting, they review people in the college who feel they've contributed the most to the American College of Nutrition, and those people are awarded a master's in the American College of Nutrition. And so...
Well, that's close enough. You apparently had an interest in nutrition to reach that deeply into it.
Oh, yes, I have, especially with this epidemic of obesity that's occurring. I'm putting together, I think that's what we're going to discuss today, how a scientist, a U.S. senator, the agriculture secretary, and a hurricane were contributory to the obesity epidemic.
Well, that would be interesting. I'd love you to explain that, what that means to you. But I'd first like to question, because when we use the word epidemic, I always feel like, just like we're involved in our current pandemic, you're well aware,
Sure.
of course, as a top physician, it seems to me that word epidemic sort of intimates that people can catch something from each other. But yet in obesity, that's not really the case.
No, and I think you're right. I think as I look at this, I realize in the title of this, I put obesity epidemic, but I really meant obesity pandemic.
Okay, and what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that if you look at obesity in the United States going back to the 1920s, and you follow it 100 years later, from 1920 to 1980, the incidence of obesity, and at that time obesity was defined, I don't know if it was back in the 20s, but now we defined obesity as a BMI greater than 30, that between 1920 and 1980, the curve was totally flat. There was no change in the incidence of obesity. It was about 20%, and it was 20% in 1920, 40, 60, and even in 80. But after 1980, it soared to where it's now 50, 60%. And so me as a scientist and somebody that's inquisitive about things, ask the big question, why? What happened in 1980 that sent this explosion of obesity and diabetes upon the world?
Well, that is a good question, because I even noticed, let's say I look at my parents. My dad was in World War II. If I look at older pictures, it seems that everybody was kind of trim. I mean, just from observation versus if you look at a high school gathering now.
Oh, exactly. I mean, I still remember in high school, like fifth or sixth or seventh grade, I mean, you would only see maybe one or two people in our class that were really overweight. Everybody else was pretty slim.
So you recognize this change, and I'm sure scientific data confirms that, right around the 80s. So you wanted to delve into like what happened that changed that.
Exactly.
So did you start investigating data, or how did you begin to investigate that?
No, I just started reviewing the data. I started looking and saying, okay, what happened? What was going on in 1980? What were some of the events going on that triggered this? And what actually got this whole thing started, which is very fascinating, that in 1950 there was a steep increase in heart disease in the United States. And it went up rather substantially from 1940 to 1950, and then even in the 1960s and 1970s. So there was this big question: what's going on in America? Why are we having this? Why is this happening? This disproportionately high rate of heart disease mortality in the United States, and again, this started climbing in a little bit in 30, more in 40, but it hit kind of a peak in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So there are a lot of people scratching their heads in the 1950s saying, what is going on? Why are we seeing this? And then this is where all the interest became in nutrition, and said, well, it must be something that we're eating that's causing this. And there was a scientist, a physiologist, Ansel Keys from the University of Minnesota. He was convinced that it was fat, that fat was bad in the diet for you, particularly saturated fat.
So you're talking about that people were eating saturated fat, and he said that's what it was.
He was convinced that the rise in heart disease was because people were consuming saturated fat. Although, if you really look at the consumption of saturated fat in America between 1900 and 1950, it really didn't change that much. So, it kind of, begs the question, why did Ansel Keys think it was saturated fat? And the long story short, it's not saturated fat. It is not saturated fat for the rise in heart disease, even though he was adamant about this. And I got to say, dishonestly, would not report some results of studies because it didn't fit his cholesterol saturated fat hypothesis.
So there was then a movement in the scientific community to embrace that belief.
Exactly. Now, there was another fella, John Yudkin, Yudkin. He was from England, and he was convinced that it was added sugar that was causing the problem. And he was very adamant that sugar was the culprit, not fats. But unfortunately, he was sort of a soft-spoken Brit, and Ansel was a very outspoken American, and the sugar industry and Ansel Keys literally just trashed John Yudkin, and he sort of just vanished into the sunset. He wrote a book in 1972 called the Pure, White, and Deadly: The Problem of Sugar. But he was chastised for it. And even some of his conferences where he was funded by like Coca-Cola, they refused to fund him anymore because they were trashing their bottom line. So
was there an increase, or you're saying that the conventional diet had about the same amount of saturated fat? You didn't see a big spike in that, although they started to say that was the reason for the obesity. But Yet there was definitely, with much more processed food, an increased consumption of white sugar. Yet that was debunked as a reason for the obesity increase.
Right, exactly. And in fact, there was an interesting exchange between George McGovern, the senator who helped with this pandemic. In 1973, he met with Yudkin, and he said, suggesting that a high-fat diet was not a problem and that cholesterol presented no danger. And that's what he told McGovern. McGovern says, I believe both. McGovern asked him, do you think that high fat intake or consuming cholesterol presents no danger? And he said, I believe both things. And then McGovern said, that is exactly the opposite of what my doctors here in the United States told me, i.e. Ansel Keys.
So in other words, looking at that high cholesterol level did not necessarily relate to more heart disease.
Well, I think you have to be careful there, because we do know that people with high cholesterols have higher incidence of heart disease. But what they could not show, and this was actually the Framingham, I'm learning so much more. In 1948 is when the Framingham study started. And you know why it started? Because of the rise in heart disease. So in 1948, but in 1958, they gave a report. And in that report, they said they saw a weak connection between cholesterol and heart disease, but they saw no link between what people consumed in their diet and heart disease. So kind of refuting that there was no link between saturated fat or total fat intake and heart disease.
And did they start reviewing the incidence of differences, let's say, in not only sugar consumption, but blood glucose levels?
I don't know. I don't think there was any there. I don't remember. I don't know the answer, but I would say that probably not, because there didn't seem to be a spike in diabetes as well at that time. It was more heart disease. So the diabetes really didn't kick in until we got into the 80s.
So what, in your introduction, you talked about the senator. I think you covered him, right? Was that McGovern? And then you talked about a hurricane. Mm-hmm. What was the hurricane part of this story?
Okay, that's the interesting part that most people don't really appreciate. In 1980, from July 31st to August 11th, in 1980, it was the strongest hurricane ever recorded, 190 miles per hour. And it went right through the Caribbean.
Okay, and how did that have to do with our story today?
Because where did sugarcane come from?
Oh, that's interesting.
In the Caribbean. So in 1980, we had a serious shortage of sugarcane. And going back to the fourth culprit, Earl Butz, who was the Secretary of Agriculture, he got the farmers in the 1970s to grow corn and corn and corn and corn and corn because Nixon needed something to save his presidency because of the Vietnam War. So he produced so much corn that it brought the price of food down. And then all of a sudden we had this huge surplus of corn and we didn't know what to do with it. Well, the Japanese perfected the high fructose corn syrup methodology in 1975. So he went to Japan and learned how to convert corn into high fructose corn syrup. And at that time, that was 1975, there wasn't really a huge increase in high fructose corn syrup at that time. It was only about 1 or 2%. But once you crossed 1980, it went up to almost, and it was like, let me see here, I was looking, it took off, it was like 1 or 2% in the 1970s. By 1980, it was 20%, and by 1985, it was almost 40% of the total sugar consumed in America.
So there was a switch from cane sugar because of the hurricane,
right,
to a rising use of high fructose corn syrup.
Exactly.
That's really interesting because, nowadays, because that term has become maligned by those people who are interested in health. And let me just reintroduce you, Doctor. You are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamhi, the natural nurse, and today my guest is Professor Emeritus Dr. Claude Lardinois, medical doctor and learned endocrinologist, who's talking to us today about some of the historic events that led to our obesity epidemic, as he's sharing, and in fact, pandemic. And thank you so much for that, Dr. Claude Lardinois. Now, so that's an interesting story. A lot of people have heard that high fructose corn syrup is bad. They heard that much. So what the industry has now done is they've changed the name of that to where they don't have to call it anymore high fructose corn syrup. They just call it corn syrup.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was not aware that they were changing it to corn syrup, but it's interesting as you say that. I'm looking at the graph of the changes in the consumption of sugars after the Hurricane Allen, and corn syrup stayed exactly the same, about 18% of the diet. So if they're labeling it as corn syrup, it's totally false. And a lot of times they just put sugar. But a lot of labels do say high fructose corn syrup, but a lot of them realize that since it's a negative connotation, they just say sugar, so people assume it can't be high fructose corn syrup.
So it has become legal now to just use the word sugar to describe high fructose corn syrup, even though it is not beet sugar and it's not sugar cane.
Exactly. So it's very, very deceptive.
So it's all kind of smoke and mirrors.
It's all in the bottom line.
Nonetheless, eating any of that stuff, it's a good idea, as I'm sure you have found through your research, to not eat all those things. So are you saying now, what about the replacement of the saturated fat with those vegetable oils? Because that was a big movement also.
Yeah. Well, I think that this switch over, everybody thought that, and if you actually do that, it's interesting. If you actually switch people over from saturated fat to a polyunsaturated fat, your cholesterols go down. Okay? But your heart disease does not change.
Now, why is that?
Because it's not the cholesterol that's causing the problem. It's other things in the diet. So just because you think you're eating healthy fats, I think all fats are healthy. I think almost all foods are healthy, except processed foods and stuff like that, if you use it in moderation.
So there is a lot of newer research in terms of different kinds of fats, like what you're talking about. Even saturated fat, that would be something that's found in meat. Yep. But the actual chemical composition can vary greatly if the animals, if these are meat animals, were fed something like genetically modified corn versus out in the field eating grass. That actually causes different kinds of saturated fat to be found in the meat.
Yeah, I would agree. How much of a difference it would make, I don't know that we really have a good study. Probably one other thing I should share with you that I think is pretty fascinating, and I think to me, it explains the increase in heart disease that occurred in the 1950s. It was not saturated fat, and I don't think it was sugar per se. Although there's no question, I actually have a funny slide that talks about fat kings and even one fat pope, and it's because they consumed a lot of sugar cane. So excess quantities will definitely have an impact on your health and well-being. But one of the things that's most fascinating to me is Procter and Gamble.
What's fascinating about Procter and Gamble, Dr. Lardinois?
Okay, well, back in the old days, when we didn't have a lot of electricity in that, we had to rely on candles and we had to rely on soap. It actually turns out that the lard from the animals, the fat from the cows and the fat from beef, were used to make candles and soap. And so Procter was actually involved in the process of making candles, and Gamble was in the process of making soap. And so you'll say, okay, well, what does that have to do with anything? All right. Well, what happened was that the beef industry had complete control of all of the materials that they needed to make candles and soap, the lard and the beef tallow. So what happened was they started to go to cottonseed oil to make their candles and make their soaps. But they found out that it was very hard to compete with all the other people in Cincinnati, because that's where Procter & Gamble were. So they, in 1907, a German chemist by the name of E.C. Kaiser, Kayser, showed up at the Procter & Gamble's headquarters in Cincinnati with a marvelous invention. And in his hand, he had a ball of fat that looked like lard. But it was not lard. It was hydrogenated cottonseed oil. So Crisco was partially hydrogenated cottonseed oil.
Yeah, that's right. So some people are old enough, like me, to remember Crisco. I would say my mom definitely used it, and it was like a white, fluffy stuff.
Everybody cooked in Crisco, but I don't think anybody had a clue that trans fatty acids was causing heart disease. So I think the rise, because they started marketing Crisco in 1911, and it takes time for the saturated fats to start to cause coronary artery disease. So there's no question in my mind that the increase in cardiovascular disease seen in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was due to products like Crisco. But nobody really understood this. And in fact, I'm sure you've heard of the Center for Science in the Public Interest.
Yes.
You ever heard of them? The CSPI? Yes. Well, they ridiculed McDonald's fries and said, because from 1984 or 1948, I think is when McDonald's started, to 1984, they fried in beef fat, coconut oil, and palm oil. And the CSPI just had a conniption. They said, how could you do this? And so in 1984, they switched to partially hydrogenated trans fatty acid vegetable oils. And CSPI made a comment. This was not for Burger King, but it was because the first people, not McDonald's, Burger King was the first one to go to partially hydrogenated, okay? Not McDonald's. So CSPI described Burger King's switch to partially hydrogenated oils in the 1980s as a great boom to the Americans' arteries.
So you think that the switch there to using that kind of fat instead of saturated fat actually is part of what led to this obesity epidemic?
No, not at all. Nothing to do with the obesity epidemic.
Okay.
It had to do with the increase in heart disease.
Okay, the increase in heart disease.
Right, but the increase in obesity had to do with the sudden dramatic change to high fructose corn syrup, which the brain actually, if you feed an adult or even an animal high fructose corn syrup, the hypothalamus does not shut off. It tells me I'm still hungry. If you give glucose, the brain says I'm full. And in 1980, it was, okay, I'll give you, from 1960 to in the 1960s, the obesity rate was 13.5%. In the 1970s, it was 14.5%. In 1980, it was 15%. So still very flat curve. But in 1988, it was up to 23.3%. And at the same time, the American population consumed an additional 425 calories a day.
So there was an increase in caloric intake and an increase in obesity. That makes sense.
Right. And the increase in caloric intake was because sugarcane was expensive. You took a lot of money for sugarcane. The other thing I didn't mention that's also important is that we were starting to have some, political differences with the Caribbean on how much they were charging us for sugarcane as well. So in the 1970s, sugarcane prices were starting to go up. Okay. And that coupled with the wipeout of sugarcane, I think is what really pushed the high fructose corn syrup. And then so what happened was this big push of high fructose corn syrup, it cost 1/4 the price for that 8-ounce Coke if you used high fructose corn syrup. So guess what happened in 1976?
What?
The 32-ounce cup appeared. It didn't have a name yet, but there was a 32-ounce cup with 7-Eleven, and they didn't know what to do with it. And all of a sudden they said, hey, we can make this the Big Gulp. And in 1980, the Big Gulp appeared, and people could go into the 7-Eleven and fill up a 32-ounce Coke for less than the price of buying an 8-ounce bottle of Coke with sugar cane. So what do you think you're going to do?
Yeah, that giant Super Size Me. There's even a great movie called Super Size Me.
Sure, absolutely.
That shows that big push to massive increase in just quantity of this very junky food.
Right. And then you just watch the obesity from 1980 to 90 to 95 to 2000 just soar like a rocket.
Yeah, that's amazing. So all of those things sort of played together to create this obesity epidemic.
Right. And what Ansel Keys did was even though he had data in 1975, he did a randomized, placebo-controlled, randomized study where he gave prisoners in Minnesota, one group 20% of their calories as saturated fat, the other group 10% as saturated fat. So he was going to prove that by doing that, you would be able to show that saturated fat increases heart disease. There was absolutely no difference in the risk of heart disease. But the one thing that was never shared was a higher incidence of cancer in the patients that had the 10% saturated fat diet. But none of that was ever published until 1989 because everybody was convinced, including McGovern, that we had to reduce fat in our diet and increase carbohydrates in our diet because that was the culprit, when there was absolutely no science whatsoever to back that up.
Wow, just amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all that very interesting data. And, Dr. Claude, we do archive our shows. So if anyone was listening today and would like to listen again or share that with their friends, thank you so much, listeners, for joining us today on Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College in Garden City, New York. For further information about this show or anything else you hear on WHPC, you can email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamhi at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us again next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.